She looked him in the eye, wiped the tears off her cheek, and said quietly, "You won't recognize me when I'm done healing." The table went silent. Tanner froze, his fork still in midair. For the first time, the laughter that usually followed his cruel jokes didn't come. His wife's eyes, tired, red, but fierce, held something unfamiliar. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was goodbye. And that was the moment he realized he had gone too far, only he didn't know it yet. Before we begin, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica. On the surface, Tanner Holt had everything people in their Boston suburb envied. A good job at a regional logistics firm, a charming colonial-style home on the outskirts of Quincy, 2 kids who got decent grades, and a wife who'd stood by him through every lean season. To anyone looking in, he was a man who'd made it. But behind closed doors, their home told a quieter truth, one that hummed through the walls in sighs and long silences. Corinne had once been the kind of woman who filled every space she entered with light. Before marriage, she worked part-time at a small bookshop near Beacon Hill, where she'd bring Tanner leftover pastries from the cafe next door. Back then, he adored her laughter, her quirks, even the little lines she made when she smiled. But after their second child, Corinne's body changed. A little softer, a little rounder. Life got busier. She barely slept. She ate late, skipped the gym, and stopped buying new clothes because, what's the point? And somewhere in that shift, Tanner's affection started to sour into something colder, a silent, sharp-edged disappointment. At first, it was small, a glance in the mirror when she walked by, a sigh when she asked for help carrying groceries. Then came the offhand comments, the ones he disguised as jokes. "Guess we're keeping DoorDash in business, huh?" he'd say with a laugh at dinner. Or, "You sure you want dessert?" in front of the kids. Corinne would smile tightly and pretend not to notice, even when her son looked uncomfortable and her daughter's eyes darted to the floor. Boston winters didn't help. They stayed indoors more, talking less. Corinne's friends drifted away. She stopped meeting them for coffee because she hated how she looked in every reflection. She found comfort in food because it didn't judge her. And Tanner, though he claimed to be worried about her health, only seemed to care about how her size made him look. The worst part wasn't his words. It was the indifference. The way he'd scroll through his phone during dinner while she tried to make conversation. The way his laughter felt performative when guests were around and dismissive when they left. By spring, their marriage had become a quiet performance, 2 people sharing a space but not a life. Corinne folded his shirts, packed his lunches, and tucked in their children. Tanner left early, came home late, and convinced himself that this distance was normal, that this was just what marriage turned into. But something in Corinne was cracking. It started at her sister's birthday barbecue in early May. The family gathered in the backyard of her sister's home in Cambridge. Music, food, and laughter everywhere. Corinne wore a loose floral dress, hoping it would hide her discomfort. For most of the afternoon, she smiled through the conversations, tried to ignore the feeling that Tanner was embarrassed by her presence. But when one of her cousins playfully teased Tanner about how good Corinne's cooking must be, Tanner smirked and said, "Oh yeah, she tastes test every batch, that's for sure." The laughter that followed was light, harmless, to everyone else. But Corinne felt it like a slap. She laughed too, a small, brittle sound, just to make it less awkward. Her face burned while she cleared plates, pretending not to care. But something in her chest twisted and stayed twisted. That night, when they got home, she stood in the bathroom and stared at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked older than her 36 years, not from age, but from being unseen. In that reflection, she realized something. She wasn't angry because Tanner had changed. She was angry because she had allowed herself to believe that love should hurt this quietly. Still, she didn't confront him. She didn't shout or cry. Instead, she started waking up earlier. She'd take short walks before dawn while the neighborhood was still asleep. Not to lose weight, at least not yet, but to breathe without being watched. Tanner noticed, but only in passing. He assumed it was a phase, just like when she tried meal plans or yoga a few years ago. He didn't realize that this quiet was different. It wasn't submission anymore. It was detachment. By mid-June, Corinne had started journaling, not about diets or resolutions, but about small moments of joy. A sunrise, the sound of rain, her daughter's laugh. Each word was like a brick rebuilding something Tanner had chipped away. And while Corinne was finding herself again, Tanner's ego grew unchecked. At work, he joked about married life weight with colleagues. He'd scroll through photos of fit couples online, imagining a different version of his life. He didn't see the irony that while he mocked his wife for letting herself go, he was the one losing everything that ever made his home feel alive. One evening, as Corinne prepared dinner, their daughter asked innocently, "Mom, why does Dad always make fun of you?" Corinne froze, the knife mid-cut on the cutting board. For the first time, she had no answer. She just said, softly, "Sometimes people forget how to be kind." And that night, after everyone was asleep, she whispered a quiet promise to herself, "This ends with me." Her life, her body, her heart, none of it belonged to his approval anymore. She didn't know how yet, but she was done living small for a man who measured love in appearances. If you've ever watched someone shrink themselves just to be loved, or if you've ever been that person, take a second before you scroll. Stories like Corinne's remind us, kindness isn't optional. It's everything. Subscribe if you believe love should never sound like shame. By midsummer, Corinne's quiet mornings had become her sanctuary. The air felt different at 5 a.m., calm, forgiving, untouched by the noise of judgment. She'd slip on her sneakers, pull her hoodie tight, and walk the same looping route through their quiet Boston neighborhood, past rows of maple trees and sleeping houses. She wasn't chasing transformation, she was chasing peace. But peace doesn't last long in a house where cruelty wears the face of normal. At first, Tanner didn't even notice her walks. Then he started making jokes about them. "Early jog, huh?" he'd mutter while scrolling through his phone. "Guess we're trying to reverse a few years too late." He said it with a smirk, the kind that hides behind humor but hits like a punch. Corinne didn't answer. She just nodded, picked up her keys, and left. It was easier than explaining that she wasn't doing this for him. Not anymore. Their kids started noticing the tension too. Tanner's impatience had grown shorter, Corinne's silences had grown longer. Family dinners felt like obligations, not moments of connection. Corinne cooked out of habit. Tanner ate out of expectation. Their son, Wyatt, would watch his father, mirroring his tone without realizing it. And that frightened Corinne more than anything else. The idea that her son might grow up thinking this was how men loved. In late July, Corinne signed up for a local fitness group in South Boston, not one of those high-pressure gyms but a community center that offered beginner-friendly classes and nutrition support. She didn't tell Tanner at first. Not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't want his approval to stain it. She went 3 times a week after work, laughing with strangers who didn't know her story. It was the first time in years she felt human again. Not the wife, not the mom, but Corinne. And while she was out reclaiming pieces of herself, Tanner was losing his grip on control. He started checking her location on his phone, pretending it was for safety. He'd comment when she got home late. "So, long workout, huh? Or are we meeting someone new?" He said it like a joke, but his tone carried something darker, insecurity disguised as sarcasm. The irony was painful. Tanner had mocked her for years, and now that she was finally standing up straighter, he felt threatened by it. One evening, Corinne came home glowing, sweat on her skin, joy in her voice. The kids were doing homework, and Tanner was watching sports in the living room. She walked past him with a small smile. "Hey," she said softly. He barely looked up. But when he did, his eyes lingered, not in admiration, but in suspicion. "New clothes?" he asked flatly. She nodded. "Yeah, just workout gear." He snorted. "Didn't know yoga pants were your thing now." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned, went upstairs, and quietly shut the bedroom door. A door that, symbolically, had already been closed for months. By August, something began to shift in the house. Corinne started eating differently, not obsessively, just mindfully. She cooked balanced meals, stopped buying the snacks Tanner liked to blame her for. The kids followed her lead. The kitchen, once filled with sarcasm, began to smell of quiet strength. But with every change she made, Tanner's resentment grew louder. He couldn't articulate it, but deep down he missed having someone to belittle. Corinne's silence made him feel irrelevant, and in his own twisted way, that scared him. At work, his coworkers joked about their wives too, the usual married man banter, they called it. Tanner laughed along, but when they teased him about Corinne's supposed glow-up, he shrugged it off too quickly. The truth was, he didn't like that other men were starting to notice the same woman he'd spent years diminishing. In early September, Corinne was invited to a charity dinner by one of her fitness instructors. She hadn't gone out socially in years. Her sister convinced her to go. She found a simple navy blue dress that fit perfectly, not because it was tight, but because it felt like her. When she stepped into the living room that night, Tanner looked up and froze. He didn't recognize her, not because of her body, but because of her confidence. For a fleeting second his chest tightened. There was a memory of the woman he used to love. But instead of saying that, he smirked and said, "Well, someone's trying hard tonight." Corinne smiled faintly and replied, "No, I'm just not trying for the wrong reasons anymore." That line stayed with him long after she left. It irritated him, how calm she was. How unaffected. Tanner poured himself a drink and muttered under his breath, "We'll see how long this lasts." But it did last. Longer than he ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, Corinne's energy became magnetic. Her laughter returned. She stopped reacting to Tanner's digs. She simply existed above them. The kids noticed. Even Tanner's mother, who'd always defended her son, commented on how different Corinne seemed. And yet, Tanner refused to see it as growth. He saw it as rebellion. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Corinne was packing her gym bag when Tanner, frustrated by her indifference, blurted out, "You think you're better than me now, huh? Just because you dropped a few pounds." Corinne stopped mid-motion. She looked at him, really looked at him. The man she once adored now looked small, not because of his stature, but because of his bitterness. "No," she said quietly. "I just finally stopped believing you." That silence that followed felt endless. Tanner didn't respond. He just stood there, jaw clenched, as she walked past him, not out of anger, but out of liberation. He'd mocked her for years to make himself feel strong. But in that moment, he realized the truth. The stronger she became, the weaker his cruelty looked. Still, Tanner wasn't done. Not yet. Because when insecurity loses control, it doesn't apologize, it plots. And what he did next would turn everything on its head. Tanner couldn't handle being the one left behind. So, the next time Corinne's name appeared on his phone, it wasn't from her, it was from someone else, with a picture that would change everything. Tanner stared at the message for a long time, his hands trembling slightly. The text came from an unknown number, and attached to it was a blurry photo, Corinne laughing beside another man outside the South Boston Community Center. The angle was deceptive, the lighting off, but Tanner's mind didn't care about context. Jealousy doesn't ask for proof, it invents its own. He zoomed in again and again, his heart pounding louder each time. The man was a trainer, one Corinne had mentioned before, friendly, supportive, maybe too much so in Tanner's paranoid mind. His thoughts spiraled instantly. He didn't think about how he'd treated her, how distant he'd been, how many times he'd made her cry. No, Tanner only thought about the humiliation. The idea that she might have moved on first. That night, when Corinne came home, he didn't say a word. He just watched her set down her keys, humming softly to herself. There was a lightness to her, the kind of peace that people earn after crawling through years of emotional bruises. But Tanner saw it as defiance. The next morning, she woke up to an empty kitchen table and a text that simply said, "Don't bother coming to the family dinner. My mother doesn't want you there." Corinne stared at the message, her stomach sinking. Tanner's family had always been polite but cold, never outright cruel, but distant, judgmental. They'd often made small, cutting remarks about her weight behind fake smiles. Corinne had endured them, hoping that love could soften their hearts. But now, it seemed Tanner had turned them against her completely. Still, she went to the dinner. She couldn't let fear or shame dictate her place anymore. When she walked into the room that evening, All conversation stopped. Tanner's mother, a sharp-eyed woman named Lois, looked her up and down as if she were inspecting a stranger. Tanner sat at the table, expressionless, his glass of wine barely touched. The kids were with their cousins in another room. Maybe that was mercy. Corinne forced a polite smile. "Evening, everyone." Lois didn't respond. She gestured for her to sit. And when Corinne did, the interrogation began, wrapped in sugar, laced with poison. "So," Lois said, folding her napkin, "we've heard you've been spending a lot of time working out. Must be nice to have that kind of freedom. Tanner works so hard." Corinne's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. She knew exactly what this was. The photo. The gossip. The accusation. Tanner still said nothing. For a moment, Corinne almost felt sorry for him. How fragile his pride must be to let his mother fight his battles. But then she realized something deeper. She wasn't angry. She was done. After dinner, she stood to leave. Tanner finally looked at her and said quietly, "You've changed." Corinne met his gaze, calm but firm. "No, Tanner. I just stopped apologizing for existing." She walked out before anyone could respond. The night air hit her face like clarity, cold but freeing. She drove home, crying not out of heartbreak but out of relief. That was the night Corinne stopped waiting for Tanner to understand her worth. Days passed. Tanner tried to justify himself to anyone who would listen. He told friends she'd lost herself, that she was obsessed with her new image. It made him feel better, to rewrite her growth into a flaw. But deep down, he knew he'd crossed an invisible line. Because every night, when he came home to that quiet house, when he saw her laughter echo through pictures of the kids, when he smelled the faint lavender from her pillow, guilt began to creep in, slow and suffocating. One afternoon, he came home early. Corinne wasn't there, but her journal was open on the kitchen counter, a page half-written. He shouldn't have read it. But he did. Every insult became a brick I had to carry. And one day, I realized I could either build a wall around myself or a bridge to freedom. I chose the bridge. Tanner dropped the journal like it burned. For the first time in years, he saw the truth laid bare. His jokes weren't harmless. His honesty wasn't love. It was cruelty, dressed as concern. And the woman he thought would always stay, had emotionally left long before her body ever would. That night, he sat in his car outside the community center, watching her leave class. She was laughing again, genuinely laughing. Not for attention, not to impress anyone, but because she was finally unafraid. And something inside Tanner broke. He thought he'd win by tearing her down. But all he'd done was prove how little of a man he'd become. When Corinne got home, she found Tanner sitting on the porch steps, staring at the ground. He looked older somehow, not from time, but from regret. He tried to speak, but the words came out tangled. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply said, "You can't undo years with one apology, Tanner." And she was right. Because real apologies aren't words, they're change. That night, Tanner slept on the couch. Not because she told him to, but because he couldn't bear the weight of the bed they once shared. The house was quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't hurt Corinne. It healed her. As autumn rolled in, Corinne grew stronger, physically and emotionally. She focused on her kids, her health, her peace. Tanner watched from a distance, silently mourning the woman he'd never truly seen until she stopped needing his approval. And while this might sound like the breaking point for her, it was actually his. Because sometimes, the real punishment isn't losing someone, it's living long enough to see how much better they become without you. Too many women spend years shrinking themselves just to be loved by someone who keeps moving the goalposts. If you've ever been made to feel like you weren't enough, remember Corinne's story. And maybe subscribe not for the story, but for every person who finally found their voice after being silenced for too long. Autumn in Boston had always been Corinne's favorite season, the way the red and gold leaves carpeted the sidewalks, the crisp smell of coffee shops, the sense of renewal in the air. But this year, the beauty of the city felt different. It wasn't an escape anymore. It was a mirror of her new beginning. The house had changed too. She'd moved Tanner's things into the guest room, not out of spite, but necessity. The energy in their shared bedroom was heavy, like a ghost that refused to leave. She filled her days with work, community volunteering, and long walks with her kids through the Boston Common. She was finally living, not just surviving someone's moods. Tanner, on the other hand, found himself trapped inside his own silence. The laughter that once annoyed him now haunted him because it no longer came from her. The smell of dinner she used to cook, the sound of her morning playlist, the notes she'd leave him on the fridge, all gone. In their place was emptiness. At first, Tanner tried to pretend it didn't bother him. He worked longer hours, hit the gym more often, convinced himself he was taking control again. But deep down, something inside him had shifted. Every time he saw his reflection, he didn't see a proud man. He saw someone who'd destroyed the best thing he'd ever had, one careless joke at a time. He started noticing things he'd ignored for years. The way Corinne's coworkers looked at her with genuine respect, how she seemed lighter around them, not because she'd lost weight, but because she'd lost fear. The way their kids clung to her more than him, as if they instinctively knew who gave them warmth and who gave them worry. And worst of all, Tanner realized that Corinne hadn't left to punish him. She'd left to protect herself. That truth stung more than any argument ever could. One evening, he came home early to find her laughing on the porch with a neighbor, Mrs. Riley, an older woman who'd lived down the street for years. The sound of her laughter used to feel like home. Now it felt like a reminder of everything he'd lost. He didn't interrupt them. He just watched from the car for a moment, then drove away again. That night, he parked outside a local bar but never went in. He just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, replaying the years of cruel jokes. The parties where he'd laughed at her expense. The dinners where he'd called her lazy for eating dessert. The quiet moments when she'd asked if he still found her beautiful, and he'd shrugged instead of answering. He'd told himself it was honesty. But really it was cowardice. Days turned into weeks. Corinne didn't ask where he went at night anymore. She didn't ask anything at all. And that silence, more than shouting ever could, forced him to face what he'd become. One Sunday morning, Tanner went to church for the first time in years. He didn't know why, maybe guilt, maybe instinct. He sat in the back pew while families filled the space with soft murmurs. The pastor spoke about grace, not the kind that forgives instantly, but the kind that requires humility first. Tanner barely heard the sermon. He just stared at the stained glass and wondered if grace was even possible for people like him. When he returned home, Corinne was in the backyard, raking leaves with the kids. She looked peaceful. The kids laughed as they jumped into the pile she'd made. And in that small, ordinary moment, Tanner saw what real love looked like. Not grand gestures or money, but the quiet, consistent warmth that keeps a family whole. He wanted to join them, but something held him back. Guilt has a way of making you feel like an outsider in your own life. That night, he sat across from Corinne at the dinner table. It had been weeks since they'd eaten together. The silence was heavy but honest. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he saw not what she'd lost, but what she'd gained. She was radiant, not because of her body, but because of her peace. And Tanner realized that no apology could ever give that back. She had earned it through pain he'd caused. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. "I don't know how to fix what I broke." Corinne didn't answer right away. She just looked at him with tired eyes. Not angry, not cruel, just resolved. "You start," she said softly, "by never breaking anyone else again." Those words stayed with him long after she went upstairs. That night, Tanner lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He realized he didn't deserve forgiveness yet. But he could still change. Not for her, she was already free. But for himself, and for the example he wanted to set for their children. In the weeks that followed, Tanner started therapy. He didn't tell Corinne, not because he wanted to hide it, but because he knew actions spoke louder than explanations. He stopped drinking so much, started showing up to his kids' events, and slowly began to rebuild what he'd once ignored. Corinne noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. The change wasn't instant, and it wasn't romantic. It was real, messy, painful, and slow. But in that slow change, Tanner began to understand what love should have been all along: respect, not control. And yet, just as it seemed they might finally find peace in their separate lives, something unexpected happened, something that would force them to face everything again. Late one evening, Corinne came downstairs holding a small envelope in her hand, her expression unreadable. Tanner looked up from the couch, confused. She placed it on the table gently and said, "I think you should read this." It was a letter, not from her, but from their son's school counselor. And what it said would change everything they thought they'd repaired. The envelope on the table looked ordinary, cream-colored, sealed with a faint school logo, but Tanner knew from the way Corinne placed it down that it wasn't. It wasn't just another permission slip or event notice. It carried weight, the kind that sat in your chest before you even opened it. He tore it open carefully, the sound of paper echoing in the still room. Inside was a letter from the school counselor, addressed to both parents. His eyes scanned the first lines quickly, but when he reached the paragraph that mentioned their son, Owen, his throat tightened. Owen has expressed ongoing anxiety at home and at school. He feels responsible for the tension between his parents and has mentioned that he believes his mother is not loved because she's not perfect. We recommend a joint session to support him emotionally during this time. Tanner's vision blurred as the words sank in. Corinne didn't speak. She just sat across from him, her fingers interlaced tightly on her lap. The silence was thick, heavier than any argument they'd ever had. It was one thing for Tanner to hurt his wife, even if he hadn't meant to destroy her spirit. But to realize that his cruelty had echoed into their son's heart, that was unbearable. He folded the letter back up, his hands trembling. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. All those nights Owen had gone quiet at dinner, all those moments he'd hugged his mother a little tighter when Tanner teased her, they weren't just childhood moods. They were silent cries he'd ignored. The next morning, Tanner called the counselor himself and scheduled the session. Corinne agreed to attend, but not for him, for Owen. At the school, sitting on the soft blue couch in the counselor's office, Tanner saw his son sitting between them. Owen fidgeted with his fingers, eyes cast down. When the counselor gently asked what he'd been feeling, the boy's voice was small but clear. "I just don't like when Dad laughs at Mom. It makes her sad. And then she doesn't talk for a long time. I thought maybe if I was better, she'd be happy again." Tanner's heart broke right there. All the justifications, the excuses, the denial, gone in an instant. He realized that his words had never just been between him and Corinne. His children had been listening, learning, absorbing what love looked like. And the example he'd set was one of shame, not respect. Tanner leaned forward, voice shaking. "Buddy," he whispered, "none of that was your fault." But he wasn't just talking to Owen. He was talking to the man he used to be, the one who thought love could coexist with cruelty. After that session, Tanner changed. Not in a loud, performative way, but in quiet, steady actions. He started cooking dinner with Owen and their daughter, letting them see what accountability looked like. He asked Corinne if she needed help, not out of pity, but partnership. He listened when she spoke. And slowly, the air in the house shifted. Corinne noticed the difference, but she was cautious. Forgiveness wasn't automatic, it was a process. There were still scars between them, moments she couldn't forget, words that replayed in her mind when the house grew quiet. But Tanner didn't rush her. For once, he respected her silence. Weeks later, on a chilly November morning, Corinne joined Tanner and the kids for a community fun run, something she'd signed up for months ago. Tanner didn't expect to run, he was just there to cheer them on. But as he stood at the sidelines, coffee in hand, watching Corinne tie her shoes and laugh with their children, he felt something unfamiliar, pride that wasn't rooted in control. When she crossed the finish line, flushed and smiling, Tanner clapped the loudest. Not because she looked different, but because she was different, and he finally saw the woman he'd spent years trying to diminish. Later that evening, they sat outside under the soft glow of the porch light. The kids had gone to bed, the house was still, and the city hummed quietly in the distance. Corinne took a deep breath and finally broke the silence. "You've changed," she said simply. Tanner nodded. "I had to." And though she didn't say it, something inside her softened. She wasn't ready to call it love again, but maybe, just maybe, she could call it peace. By Christmas, they weren't a perfect family. But perfection had never been the goal. Tanner had learned that love isn't about control, or appearance, or pride. It's about the quiet work of kindness, done every day, even when it's uncomfortable. Corinne had learned something too. You can rebuild a life from the ashes of pain, but only if you stop waiting for someone else to see your worth. And their kids, they learned that words matter deeply. That what we say to those we love can build them up or break them down. Months later, at a small family dinner, Owen looked up and said, "Mom, you're my hero." Corinne smiled. Not because she needed validation, but because she'd finally become the kind of woman her younger self dreamed of being. Across the table, Tanner smiled too. There was no jealousy this time, no bitterness, just gratitude that he'd been given the chance to grow before it was too late. Sometimes the cruelest wounds aren't physical, they're the ones carved by words we say too easily. Tanner learned too late that love can't survive where mockery lives, and Corinne proved that self-respect is the first step toward healing. If this story reminded you that kindness is louder than pride, subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another person is still waiting to hear that they are enough, just as they are.